Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the Mana Fix, where we cover commander deck techs across various archetypes, budgets, and themes. In this deck tech, I'm going to cover one of my favorite commanders and the deck that I actually play the most often, well, at least when we aren't dealing with COVID. And that commander is Zacama Primal Calamity. Zacama is a 9/9 legendary elder dinosaur with vigilance, reach, and trample that costs white, green, red, and 6 other, so 9 total. She says, and yes, I will be referring to Zacama as a girl because I happen to think she's a girl. And that's that. Okay, so she says, when Zacama Primal Calamity enters the battlefield, if you cast it, untap all lands you control. Zacama also has 3 activated abilities. The first ability costs 1 red and 2 other to have Zacama deal 3 damage to a target creature. The second ability costs 1 green and 2 other, and it destroys a target artifact or enchantment. Finally, the third ability costs 1 white and 2 other, and when activated, will gain us 3 life. Obviously, the first 2 abilities are the most important, as they'll allow us to control the board state. And that's really what this deck is all about. We're going to ramp to 9 mana as fast as humanly possible. Then, once we have Zacama out, we'll be controlling the board with its abilities until we can land one of our combos and finish everyone off. This deck is pretty much all about generating as much mana as we can, so we're running cards that make our lands tap for extra mana, cards that'll untap our lands, cards that'll synergize with lands entering the battlefield, etc, etc. Now let's dig into this deck and see how it'll play. First, let's talk about ramp. 9 mana is a hefty price to pay for a commander, and we need to get there as fast as possible. Wild Growth and Utopia Sprawl each cost 1 green mana for an aura enchantment that targets a land we control. Wild Growth will make that land tap for an additional green mana, and Utopia Sprawl will make it tap for an additional mana of a color that we choose when it enters the battlefield. These cards are great because they each ramp us by 1 for just 1 mana. The only other type of card you can get that much value from for 1 mana is on a creature, and as we know, those are much more vulnerable to removal than these auras are. Another plus is these have synergy with the next ramp card, Arbor Elf. We can tap this elf to untap a forest we control. If one of the 2 previously mentioned cards are enchanting a forest, this card will ramp us by 2 instead of just 1. Next, we have a lot of the usual suspects in Rampant Growth, Nature's Lore, and Farseek. These are solid 2 mana options that'll fetch us a land and put it onto the battlefield. We're also running Sakura Tribe Elder, which is essentially Rampant Growth on a creature, and Lotus Cobra. Lotus Cobra is an incredibly powerful card in a deck like this. As I'm sure you can already tell, we're running tons of land ramp, as well as ways to play extra lands each turn, which we'll talk about later. These things in conjunction with a Lotus Cobra on the battlefield means we'll have lots and lots of mana to work with. And moving to the 3 mana slot, we have Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, and Harrow. Cultivate and Kodama's Reach are great 3 mana options for any ramp deck. They'll each fetch us 2 basics and put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other into our hand to ensure we have a land drop on the following turn. Harrow is a bit different. It requires us to sacrifice a land in addition to paying its mana cost, but fetches 2 basics and puts them onto the battlefield untapped, leaving that 2 mana open to potentially cast another spell. Also in the 3 mana slot is Search for Tomorrow. Now hard casting this for 3 will only get us 1 basic land, but it does come in untapped. The best mode to use with this though is the Suspend for 1 green. If we suspend this on turn 1, on turn 3 we'll cast it for free at our upkeep, and that will put us up to 4 lands. Now we do have just a couple 4-drop ramp cards. Those are Skyshroud Claim and Migration Path. Skyshroud Claim is a sorcery that allows us to search for 2 forest cards and put them onto the battlefield. So this can get shock lands, and we can have them enter untapped if we want to. Migration Path has to get basics, so it's essentially explosive vegetation, but it's strictly better because it's got cycling for 2, so in the late game when we don't need ramp anymore, we can replace it with a new card. So we have a subcategory to ramp here, and that's cards that allow us to play extra lands. Exploration is a 1 mana enchantment that allows us to play an extra land on each of our turns. So this one is real cheap and it gets the job done. Oracle of Moldiah has the same effect on a 2/2 creature, but it also allows us to play lands off the top of our library, giving us a better chance to take advantage of that ability. Burgeoning is a 1 mana enchantment that triggers whenever one of our opponents plays a land. When this happens, we're allowed to play a land from our hand. If we play this on turn 1, we could potentially have 5 lands in play by turn 2, which is insane. And finally, there's Azusa Lost but Seeking, which allows us to play 2 additional lands on each of our turns. Obviously, this is a lot better than being able to play 1 additional land each turn, and it also has incredible synergy with Crucible of Worlds and Fetch lands if we're running them. On each of our turns, we can play the same fetch land from our graveyard 3 times to take full advantage of Azusa. The value in this interaction is outstanding. Now, as I said before, this deck doesn't just want to ramp, it wants to produce as much mana as possible. And that's exactly what these mana doublers are going to do for us. You could really look at all of these cards as all-stars because they're all really good with our commander. Mana Reflection is the OG mana doubler. This 6 mana enchantment doubles the amount of mana that our lands tap for. It applies to artifacts as well, but we're only running Soul Ring, so that won't really come up too often. Mirari's Wake doesn't necessarily double our mana output, but does add an additional mana whenever we tap one of our lands. It also gives all of our creatures +1/+1, which may come in handy from time to time. Zendikar Resurgent is a 7 mana enchantment that has the same triggered ability that Mirari's Wake does. This enchantment will also draw us cards whenever we cast a creature spell. Regal Behemoth is a Mirari's Wake on a creature. It's a bit situational because it'll only have this effect if we're the Monarch. Luckily, this creature makes us the Monarch when it enters the battlefield. So that of course is going to draw us cards as well. I'm sure you'll be shocked to see that Vorinclex is in this deck too. Look, I'm sorry, this card is just way too good not to include. The mana doubling effect and the extent to which it slows down our opponents makes it very difficult to pass up. Last is Nyxbloom Ancient. This card is absolutely insane, as it's not just a mana doubler, it's actually a mana tripler. Having this out with Zacama is pretty much going to mean that our opponents won't have any non-land permanents on the battlefield. Once we get Zacama out, there's one card in particular that's going to help us tremendously with controlling the board, and this is the true all-star of the deck. Seedborn Muse is a 2/4 spirit creature for 2 green and 3 other. This creature untaps all permanents we control during each other player's untap step. This is amazing with Zacama because it allows us to tap out activating her abilities on our own turn, and then do the same on each of our opponent's turns. In most cases, this will mean that our opponents will never have another creature, artifact, or enchantment on the board, and will also probably be gaining some life along the way. We're also running Wilderness Reclamation, which has a similar effect, but it's only going to untap our lands once at our end step. Still, this allows us to use Zacama's ability twice as much as we'd otherwise be able to. As with any deck, we're running plenty of ways to draw cards. Ramping is fun, but it's not very effective unless we have cards to cast with all of that mana. Nissa Vital Force is a great way to draw cards in this deck. Generally, what we want to do with her is get to her -6 as quickly as possible. She starts at 5, so on the turn she comes down, we're going to +1 her and turn one of our lands into a 5/5. This is great because it acts as a blocker for her if we don't have any other creatures out to help with that. Then, on the following turn, as long as she hasn't taken any damage, we'll be able to use her -6. This ultimate gives us an emblem that says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we draw a card. This is a fantastic effect to have in a deck that runs tons of ramp. And if we do manage to get this emblem, we'll be drawing tons of cards. And going along with this theme, we're running Tireless Tracker. This creature creates a clue whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. We can sacrifice the clues for 2 mana to draw a card. We already mentioned Crucible of Worlds, but a similar card is Ramunap Excavator. This, in short, is Crucible Worlds on a creature. Now I have these in the card advantage category because, in all actuality, that's exactly what they are. These cards are making land cards in our graveyard playable, so they're essentially adding these cards to our hand, which is card advantage. In this deck, we have a number of card draw cards that care about the power of our creatures. The reason for this is because our commander is a 9/9 and drawing 9 cards is spicy. The most simplistic version of this is Life's Legacy. This 2-mana sorcery requires us to sacrifice a creature, but in doing so, we'll draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Now I know what you might be thinking. Do we really want to sacrifice Zacama to this? Yes. By God, yes we do. You'll find in playing this deck that, particularly with a mana doubler on the battlefield, we have more than enough mana to cast Zacama again and again and again, regardless of commander tax. Sometimes, and actually a lot of the time, sacrificing Zacama and recasting her will even net us mana. We'll go over this idea in more detail a little bit later. Just know that it's okay to sacrifice Zacama to an ability like this. Greater Good is very similar, except this effect is on an enchantment, so it's repeatable. Garruk Primal Hunter is up next. This guy's -3 allows us to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures we control. This will pretty much always be Zacama, but if there are other times where Zacama's not on the battlefield, we also have creatures like Vorinclex, Regal Behemoth, or Nyxbloom Ancient that'll allow us to draw a healthy number of cards with this ability. Rishkar's Expertise is the last card in this category and may be one of the better draw spells in our deck. This spell says we draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures we control. Afterwards, we can play a card from our hand with CMC 5 or less without paying its mana cost. Ideally, we'll be drawing 9 cards and casting a 5 mana card for free, which is excellent value for a 6 mana sorcery. As with any good commander deck, removal is imperative. Now we have removal on our commander, but we can't always rely on this being available. Swords to Plowshares is a 1 mana instant that exiles a creature. Its controller will gain life equal to its power, but we really don't care about that in Commander. Beast Within and Chaos Warp both have the ability to get rid of any permanent type for just 3 mana. Beast Within will leave behind a 3/3, which, again, is not something we really care about. Chaos Warp is going to allow our opponent to reveal the top card of their library, and if it's a permanent card, put it onto the battlefield. Typically, this will either be a non-permanent card, a land, or something otherwise non-impactful. Finally, there's Decimate. I really like this removal spell because it gets rid of a creature, enchantment, artifact, and land all for just 4 mana. If we're able to cast this card, the value we get from this is amazing. The issue with it is sometimes we aren't able to play it if we don't have something to target for each of those permanent types. If nobody has an enchantment or another permanent type listed on this card, we cannot cast this card. So sometimes it will be a dead card in our hand. But the value we can potentially get from this makes it worth playing, in my opinion. Now we're running 2 board wipes in this deck as well. Hour of Revelation destroys all non-land permanents for 6 mana. However, it may end up costing just 3 white mana if there are 10 or more non-land permanents on the battlefield. If it's imperative to wipe the board, it's very likely that there are already 10 or more non-land permanents on the board, so this mode really is not difficult to pull off. Austere Command is the other board wipe we're running. This board wipe is very flexible. Its modes will often allow us to fix it so that we're removing a majority of our opponent's permanents, but saving a few of our own in the process. This can turn the tables quite easily. Now, believe it or not, this deck is in some ways a combo deck. We're running a few different infinite combos, but first we'll start with one combo that doesn't quite go infinite. That combo is the interaction between our commander and Food Chain. With this card on the battlefield, we cast Zacama and untap all of our lands. Let's pretend we have 9 lands, which is the bare minimum that we need to cast Zacama. Now all 9 of our lands are untapped. Next, we activate Food Chain and exile Zacama to produce 10 mana of any one color. Now let's recast Zacama, tapping all of our lands and 2 of the mana that we have floating. Zacama enters and her trigger untaps all of our lands. After this, we're left with 8 floating mana. Again, we'll use Food Chain to exile Zacama, adding 10 mana to our mana pool. We now have a total of 18 floating mana. Zacama costs 13 now. So we'll tap all of our lands and use 4 floating mana to cast Zacama. Zacama enters and untaps all of our lands. Let's activate Food Chain, putting our total to 24 total mana. We'll tap out and use 6 of our 24 floating mana to cast Zacama again, leaving us with 18 floating mana. Again, we'll exile Zacama with Food Chain, adding 10 for a total of 28 floating mana. Now 8 of our floating mana will be used to recast Zacama for, the 4th time? At this point, we end up with all of our lands untapped and 20 floating mana. Now at this point, we've reached the peak of this interaction because the additional cost to start recasting Zacama is going to make it so that it begins to generate less and less mana each time. Keep in mind though, this is only the bare minimum number of lands we need to start this combo. If we have more lands or a mana doubler on the battlefield, we can take this interaction even further. However, I think you get the idea. Basically, Food Chain is going to create enough mana to win us the game, or at the very least, allow us to wipe the board and gain a little life on the side. Now let's move on to the infinite combos. The most obvious one I think is Zacama combined with Temur Sabertooth. All we need for this combo is these 2 creatures on the battlefield and lands that are able to tap for a total of 12 mana. We activate Temur Sabertooth's ability targeting Zacama. This will return Zacama to our hand. We'll have 10 mana remaining, so we use 9 of that to recast Zacama. In response to Zacama's untap trigger, we float the 1 mana from the land that's still untapped. Zacama's trigger resolves and we untap all of our lands. We can now repeat this over and over again, each time floating 1 mana, thus demonstrating an infinite combo. Cloudstone Curio is similar to this. Let's say we have Cloudstone and Zacama on the battlefield and we have a cheap creature such as Arbor Elf in our hand. If we cast the Arbor Elf, Cloudstone Curio will trigger and we can return Zacama to our hand. We can then cast Zacama again, floating any additional mana we have before the trigger resolves. When Zacama enters, that will also trigger Cloudstone, and we can return Arbor Elf to our hand. Again, we cast the Arbor Elf, triggering the Cloudstone Curio, and beginning the loop all over again. Now obviously we need to have a way to close out the game once we have infinite mana. My favorite way to do this is with Mycosynth Lattice. The most important thing with this card is that it turns all permanents into artifacts. What that means is that with infinite mana, we can now destroy every permanent on the battlefield, including our opponent's lands. Now that we have everything and our opponents will have nothing for the rest of the game, we can finish everyone off by dealing lethal commander damage to them with Zacama. And finally, we come to an infinite combo that's actually going to win us the game on the spot. This can be done with Aggravated Assault in either Bear Umbra, Sword of Feast and Famine, or Nature's Will. All three of these cards untap our lands whenever a creature attacks or deals combat damage. So generally, we'll be using one of these cards in conjunction with Zacama to untap all our lands. Then, in the following main phase, we'll activate Aggravated Assault to create an additional combat phase. In that combat phase, we'll be able to untap all of our lands again, allowing us to activate Aggravated Assault again in the following main phase. So we'll always have enough mana to activate Aggravated Assault, meaning we'll be able to attack infinitely and kill off all of our opponents. With any deck running combos, Tutors are going to be a great addition to our deck to help find us what we need. We're running 6 total Tutors in the deck. With Worldly Tutor, we can search our library for any creature at instant speed and put it on top of our library. This is one of the cheapest tutors in the deck and is good both in the early game to grab a ramped creature like Azusa or Oracle of Moldiah, or in the late game to grab a mana doubler or our main combo piece. Chord of Calling is an instant speed tutor that can put a creature from our library directly onto the battlefield. It has Convoke, so our creatures can help to cast it. Natural Order may just be the best tutor in the deck. As an additional cost to cast this, we have to sacrifice a green creature. If this resolves, we search our library for any green creature and put it directly onto the battlefield. Playing this on turn 4 or earlier if we ramped means getting out something like a Nyxbloom Ancient really early. The last creature tutor we have is Signal the Clans. This is an instant speed tutor for 1 green and 1 red. With this, we search our library for 3 creatures with different names and reveal them. One of these cards gets chosen at random and goes into our hand. The other 2 are shuffled back into our library. We have a number of creatures that we can search for in this deck, particularly in the late game where even if the worst card we choose gets randomly chosen, it's still going to benefit us quite a bit. For example, if we're going for mana doublers, we can search up Vorinclex, Regal Behemoth, and Nyxbloom Ancient, and even the worst of these 3 cards is still going to help us out a lot. Finally, we have Idyllic Tutor and Enlightened Tutor. Idyllic Tutor is a 3-mana sorcery that can get any enchantment and put it into our hand. This can grab a mana doubler or one of our combo pieces like Aggravated Assault or Nature's Will. Enlightened Tutor will do much the same thing for us. This spell is an instant and is cheaper to cast, but puts the card on top of our library rather than into our hand. This one is also able to get artifacts though, so we can search for cards like Mycosynth Lattice, Cloudstone Curio, or Sword of Feast and Famine with this. As with any of our deck techs, we'll go over the utility lands that are going to help us out with our strategy. First up, Cavern of Souls is a must-have in this deck. If Zacama gets countered, it's going to majorly stall our game plan. Cavern of Souls will help ensure that she resolves. Command Beacon is going to help us if Zacama ends up costing too much for us to cast. We can tap and sacrifice this land to bypass our commander tax and put Zacama into our hand. Arch of Araska is another colorless land that has an ability that allows us to pay 5 and tap it to draw a card. This can only be done if we have the City's Blessing, but with the way we ramp, we won't be hard to get there. This is basically a last resort card draw in case we get stuck with a ton of mana and nothing to cast. The last utility land to cover is Sanctum of Eternity. This land will actually allow us to go infinite with Zacama. As long as we have this land and other lands that tap for a total of 12 mana, we can infinitely return Zacama to our hand and recast it, floating 1 mana each time. And with that, that will conclude our deck tech for today. Thanks for watching. Are there any inclusions you think I missed? Let me know about it in the comments. And make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any new deck techs. You can also follow us on Twitter at TheManaFixMTG. Thanks for getting your fix with me today. As always, stay safe, and peace out, guys.